Hello, folks. Welcome to the inaugural Great Questions lecture series. Right? Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Each semester, we're going to invite some really interesting people from outside of ACC to talk about some of the books that we read in the Great Questions seminars. In this inaugural lecture, we're delighted to invite Dr. Roosevelt Montás from Columbia University. Roosevelt was born in the Dominican Republic and moved to New York City as a teenager. He attended public schools in Queens and then Columbia College, Columbia University, where he studied comparative literature and philosophy. In 2003, he completed a Ph.D. in English, also at Columbia, and began teaching in the faculty of the English department in 2004. In 2008, he was appointed the director of the Center for the Core Curriculum, a position he held for 10 years. And currently, he is a senior lecturer in American Studies. Roosevelt specializes in Antebellum American literature and culture, with a particular interest in American national identity. His dissertation, Rethinking America, won Columbia University's 2004 Bancroft Award. In 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a Graduate Student, and in 2008, he received the Dominican Republic's National Youth Prizes. He teaches moral and political philosophy in the Columbia Core Curriculum, as well as seminars in American literature and culture in the American Studies program. And each summer, he teaches a course in political theory and citizenship to high school students throughout Columbia's Freedom and Citizenship program. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Montás to Austin Community College.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Ted, I met Ted at a conference of the Association of Core Texts and Courses a couple of years ago, and I learned about the Great Questions seminar that he was at that point just putting together and conceiving. And I was scheduled to chair a panel of kind of research, 3 big research universities with programs, core curriculum programs that are in the same spirit as a Great Questions seminar, Yale, Columbia, and the University of Chicago. And I invited Ted to join the panel and present on what he was doing, even though he was scheduled to chair a different session at the same time as that panel, but we were able to figure it out. And Ted came and joined us, and he, of course, was the most interesting and substantive speaker of the panel. So I'm really glad to be here in your turf, Ted. Thank you. So I'm here to talk about liberal education and human freedom, and to do so by reflecting on the Meno, which those of you who've taken the seminar or are taking the seminar have read. Let me begin by saying that I think that it's more important that liberal education be offered at our community colleges than anywhere else, for the simple reason that these institutions are the most accessible to first-generation and low-income college students, the population whose life circumstances are most likely to lead to a life less free, more compelled, more coerced. For contrary to the destructive but popular narrative, liberal education is not a frivolous privilege of the elite, but it is in fact the most powerful tool we know of to affect the most fundamental kind of liberation. So it should not surprise us, knowing how things work in our society, that our educational systems seem designed precisely to put liberal education out of reach of those who would most benefit from it and who have traditionally been excluded from access to the tools of political agency. For those populations, the education most readily available is an education for servitude, an education for obedience and docility, an education in not asking questions. So the idea that liberal education is only for the already privileged, for the pampered elite, is a way precisely of excluding the already marginalized, of reinforcing inequality, of keeping those who are down, down. So I'm not saying anything radical here. It's an obvious point. Just look at who sends their children to liberal arts colleges and look at where liberal arts college graduates go. So we should be suspicious, highly suspicious, of the ideology that says that our open access institutions, especially our community colleges, need to privilege practical and vocational education over liberal arts education. Don't fall for it. This idea, I understand, has easy appeal, like those fake shiny trinkets at the 99-cent store. Our students need jobs. We need to focus on giving them marketable skills and opening job opportunities for them. Easy appeal. But what if we get our students thinking not about what job they want to have, but about what kind of life they want to live? What if we start preparing our students not just to look for jobs, but to design authentic ways of living? What if our goal isn't just about making a living, but about living well? If we do not approach education in this way, we do not educate for freedom, but for servitude. We train workers, not people. We look at our students' hands rather than at their souls. The origins of liberal education tell us a lot about what should be its proper role in our society. So liberal education, first, let me say something about the term liberal, because the term liberal is often misleading, and people misunderstand what liberal means in liberal education. And it's because in our political spectrum, there's a liberal end and there's a conservative end. So it's easy to think, and many people do think, that liberal education is about education in or for the liberal end of the political spectrum. And the fact that so many universities, or the universities in general, are dominated by liberal-leaning faculty members lends kind of support to that misapprehension, to that misunderstanding of what liberal education is. Liberal education is not education in liberal politics or education on how to be a liberal. In fact, in academic politics, people who are serious advocates of liberal education tend to be thought of as conservative. That is, a rigorous liberal arts education is actually, within the academic spread, a conservative curriculum. So liberal in the sense of liberal education does not mean liberal in the sense that that word is used in the American political landscape. In fact, even that word, if you apply it to the European landscape, like who is a liberal in Europe is not the same as who is a liberal in America. But what does the term mean in the term liberal education? How is the term used? We can understand that if we go back to the origin of the use of that moniker, liberal education. Liberal education essentially was invented in ancient Athens, in what was the first functional democracy. The first, if you're a historian of democracy, you might argue and say there are some antecedents, but really the first major and successful experiment in large-scale democratic governance is Athens. Now, Athens was a slave society, which I think immediately might make one wonder whether there is a relationship between slavery and democracy. And of course, our own democracy was a slave democracy. There's a line from Thomas Paine where he says that what Athens did in miniature, we're going to do in large scale, and it's kind of true, including the slavery, that what we did was in large scale compared to the miniature version in Athens. And a subsequent question that you might wonder about is whether even now that we don't have slavery as part of our democracy, or at least legal slavery, there are forms of subjugation and exploitation that in fact are implicated in our social structure. But back to Athens, a slave society governed by a democratic male citizenry. The question arose, so Athens was a direct democracy, unlike ours, where we choose representatives who then go and meet and make laws and actually do the governing. Athens was a direct democracy in that every citizen actually voted directly on the laws. Every citizen sat on juries. Every citizen deliberated on war strategy and served in the army. And every citizen served in political office. They used to take turns into serving political office. So it's a direct democracy. So the question emerges, what kind of education is appropriate, is necessary to fulfill the responsibilities of a free individual, of a citizen, that is liberal for the free, as opposed to slave education or applied education? In our contemporary world, the contrastive terms to liberal education are vocational education or technical education or pre-professional education, applied education, as opposed to liberal education. Back in Athens, liberal education was that education that was appropriate for those who were free. That is, those people who had to make decisions about the laws of the society, had to make decisions about military strategy, had to make decisions about guilt or innocence, including in the death penalty, had to serve in the army. These were the duties of citizenship. And if you think about it, what do you need to know in order to be the governor or be governing a free society, a free city? You obviously need to know about history, and you probably need to know about human psychology, and you need to know about military strategy, and you need to know about the economics, and you need to know about lawmaking, and you need to know probably about theology. In fact, there is no area of human knowledge and activity that is outside of the purview that you need to be conversant in order to be a meaningful participant in a self-governing society. That's what liberal education starts as, the education that was appropriate for the people who were free. A quote from Aristotle, who's thinking about this question in ancient Athens. He writes, "The best city-state will not confer citizenship on vulgar craftsmen, for it is impossible to engage in virtuous pursuits while living the life of a vulgar craftsman or a hired laborer." That's a sentiment that I think we fundamentally reject now. What do you mean that if you're a hired laborer or a vulgar craftsman, you can't be a citizen? But what Aristotle is getting at is that there is a kind of cultivation that is required for the meaningful exercise of self-governance that can only be cultivated and developed if you don't spend all of your energy in just making a living. If all of your energy and effort goes into simply making ends meet, you will not be able to cultivate those capacities that equip you and enable you to exercise the duties of citizenship. Another quote from Aristotle, also from the Politics, "It is evident then that there is a certain kind of education that children must be given, not because it is useful or necessary, but because it is noble and suitable for a free person." A kind of education that is given not because it is useful or necessary, but simply because it is noble and suitable to a free person. Aristotle, as you probably know, was a contemporary of, though younger than Plato, and one generation removed from the archetypal figure of liberal education, that is, the old man Socrates. As advertised in the title of my talk, in thinking about liberal education and human freedom, I want to give some attention to Plato's Meno. So let me turn to the Meno. I like the Meno very much. It's a book worth reading because it's a book that tries to grapple with the most important questions, the great questions. And it wastes no time in doing so. The opening line of the Meno jumps right in. "Can you tell me, Socrates, can virtue be taught?" Can virtue be taught? What does that question mean? What is it that Meno is asking whether it can be taught? Well, virtue. But what is virtue? What we mean by virtue is largely what this dialogue and what much of Socratic inquiry is about. It is one of the most important questions, one of the great questions that seminars that many of you have taken, are taking, or are teaching asks. Can we answer that question today? Can we do better than Socrates did? Probably not, but we must try. We must resist the defeatist attitude that denies our capacity for inquiry into such questions, or the prejudiced attitude that says that questions like this don't belong in a community college classroom. It is an attitude that tries to cut our desire for truth, tries to cut our desire for truth at the knees. But ultimately, only truth satisfies. In the Meno itself, Socrates tells us why sincere inquiry is of the essence. He says, I would contend at all costs, both in word and deed, as far as I could, that we will be better men, braver, and less idle, if we believe that one must search for the things one does not know, rather than if we believe that it is not possible to find out what we do not know, and that we must not look for it. So we must persist in the search for important things we don't know. We will be better men, braver, and less idle. You will forgive Socrates' gendered use of language here. He's not talking just about males. The point applies to everyone, regardless of gender. We will be better people, braver, and less idle. Persisting with these questions means not settling for easy answers, tolerating and not turning away from the discomfort of not knowing. For after all, the great questions, the most important questions in our lives, are the ones that are worth the most effort, and they are not likely to be the easiest and most straightforward to answer. On the contrary, because of their decisive importance, because they are the questions around which we shape our lives, they are persistent, elusive, and mysterious. But this should not discourage us. We must persist in our perplexity. Like Meno's servant, we have to first reach a state of perplexity before we can really learn anything. We have to first shed the delusion that we know the answer to the most important questions. So again, to the opening of the dialogue, can virtue be taught? What is Meno asking whether it can be taught? Virtue. But what do we mean by virtue? What did Socrates mean by virtue? We can take a first step in our investigation by noting that Socrates did not speak English. We can ask, what word did he use in Greek? And can we look up that word and get a better understanding of what it is than by simply translating it as virtue? I think that this is a productive line of inquiry. I don't know any Greek, but I have friends who do. And they tell me that the word Socrates uses here is the Greek word arete. Even if we don't know Greek, we can still read Wikipedia, and it has an entry on arete. We learn, for example, that it means excellence, and it's related to its related word aristos means the best. So we can see that the Greek word found its way to fully English words like aristocrat, someone belonging to an elite class or to a social nobility. And we also have the word aristocracy, which is used to describe the political order in which, in its pure form, power is held by the best people, but which in practice has always meant that power is held by those born with privilege. So by this word arete, we should understand not only virtue, but also excellence, like when we call a musician a virtuoso, that is, someone with exceptional skill. By reading Plato, and it's right here in the Meno, you can see that the Greeks had a way of speaking about different kinds of arete or virtue or excellence. For example, they might say that the virtue or excellence of a knife is one thing, and the virtue of a cell phone another thing. They might say that the virtue of a knife, its excellence, is cutting, whereas the excellence of a cell phone is clear reception. This understanding of arete immediately raises another of those most important questions. What is the excellence of a human being? What constitutes arete in a person? What is human excellence? All of these questions are contained in the central question of the Meno. What is virtue? The question of what is human excellence immediately leads to the master question of liberal education. That is, to put it in Socrates' own words in the Republic, which whole way of life would make living most worthwhile for each of us? I say that this is the root question of all liberal education. It is the question of the human good. What kind of life is most worth living for each of us? What is worth striving after? What is the good life? What is arete for a human being? What is the human good? A liberal education organized around the study of foundational texts is the best way, in my opinion, to exercise our minds in this direction. We read old texts in which great minds of the past have exercised themselves in this direction. And we find that the great minds differ amongst themselves about this master question. They do not speak with one voice, but again and again disagree with each other about the most important questions. So when we read them, we can't just accept the answer we get or the answer that we think we're getting from them. We have to go in there and enter the fray with them. We have to look at what one writer says and hold it up against what another writer says and what 3 other writers say. We have to try to understand their disagreements, also their agreements. And then, most important of all, we have to hold up what they say against our own experience. For we too are human, and nothing that is human is beyond us. We fully partake of the human condition. And it is we, each of us ourselves, that must answer the question, what kind of life is most worthwhile living for me? No one can answer that question for us. Indeed, a liberal education is not about giving you answers, but about equipping you, often by perplexing you, to ask better questions. A liberal education teaches you to look steadily in the face of ambiguity at the most important questions. We're searching, all of us, for a sense of intellectual wholeness, for a sense of an authentic self. For we are caught in a mystery, in a paradox. We can't wrap our minds around our own being. We are, and we don't know quite what that is. We can't get behind the fact of being and understand what it is to be beings such as we are. We find ourselves here, and we don't know how it happens that we're here, and we don't know what it means that we are here or what it is that we are. We are gripped by this fundamental mystery, all of us, and there is no escaping it. Anyone who thinks that education should not be concerned with this condition, does not know what education is. In his treatise on liberty, John Stuart Mill writes that human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the internal forces that make it a living thing. The non-liberal part of your education teaches you as if you were a machine, a learning machine, that needs to be fed with codified information and instructions to execute specialized tasks. And for sure, part of your education needs to be like that. But that's not the end of it. You are not just an empty drive for the storage of information, nor are you a slave bound to a master. You don't just require education in how to obey commands and execute instructions written by someone else. You are a free person. You should write your own instructions and be masters of yourselves. That's the kind of education we should provide for you. We should be educating you liberally. I like the agricultural analogy that Mill uses. You are a tree that requires to grow and develop itself on all sides according to the internal forces that make you a living thing. So education, liberal education, is not about instruction, it's about cultivation. When you plant a tree, what you need to give the tree is the conditions under which it can become what it is in potential. That is, you give it the right amount of water, the right amount of light, the right temperature, and the right humidity, perhaps, and that's it. Then you let it become, you maintain those conditions, and you let it become what it is. This is the task of liberal education, cultivating those human capacities and potentialities that are inherent in every student by providing a context in which the student can develop him or herself. So liberal arts cultivates the capacities that you draw on when you encounter something that you don't understand, when you encounter the perplexity that continually characterizes our human experience. Writing in 1925 in a series of lectures published under the title Science and the Modern World, the British philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead worried about modern education and modern science training minds in a groove. That is, training minds in a way that they were constrained by certain formal disciplinary requirements. Liberal education is about education outside of the groove. Liberal education is about minds that are liberated from the premises that they have drawn from their own experience. To put it in its simplest terms, a liberal education liberates. One of my favorite passages in American literature comes from the narrative of the life of an American slave by Frederick Douglass. Let me read you this from chapter 4 of the narrative. This comes at a point where Frederick Douglass, who was born in a plantation and raised in a plantation until he's maybe about 8, is moved to Baltimore, to the big city, to serve as a child companion to the child of his owner's brother-in-law. So he goes there, big city, really different life, even for a slave, than the life he was living in a plantation. So he writes, "Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point in my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an L. An L is kind of the side of a house, the corner of a house, the whole 2 wings of a house. He will take an L. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that nigger, speaking about myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing problem, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I the least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest accident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever trouble, to learn how to read. And of course he does, and learns how to write too. I get goosebumps from this passage where Douglas realizes, A, that the kind of learning that gets opened by the capacity to read was the key to the white man's power over the black man. It was a power that came from literacy, from access to the reservoir of knowledge that we have built as humans. Second, this line, from the mouth of Mr. Old, that learning to read would forever unfit him to be a slave. And these words from Douglas, from that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. But today, you might say there is no more slavery. That thing was outlawed. That's not quite true. There is no longer, in the US, chattel slavery, where you are literally owned by someone else 24/7 and for the rest of your life. But there are other forms of slavery all around us, forms of subjugation, coercion, and domination. One of the most pervasive forms of slavery around us today is what some people call wage slavery. That is when you sell your labor for a period of time and are, during that time, subject to someone else. This form of slavery was recognized even in antiquity, when there still existed chattel slavery. One of those old writers that like to ask fundamental questions, Cicero, mentions it in his famous book on duties, where he says that whoever gives his labor for money sells himself and puts himself in the rank of slaves. It's almost taken for granted today that this is okay, that it's some kind of life to sell yourself to servitude and dehumanization from Monday to Friday in order to buy the privilege of living on the weekends. But it's not so. This is not the worthiest life for a human being. There is no human arete in that, no expression of human dignity, but on the contrary, degrading, dehumanization, and brutalization of virtue. So it's not right that college education should be about preparing to sell some portion of your humanity for wages. Yes, of course, education should give you skills and competencies that should help you find a job. But there is also a higher calling, and the liberal arts are the curricular expression of that calling. Education should also be about how to be free, about how to live the life of a free individual, not just the life of a hired laborer. We can look at the meaning of the word education. It's very useful to understand the history of words. Education comes from the Latin verb educere, which means to draw out, to bring out, or to lead out. Education, true education, concerns the tapping of innate capacities that each of us carry inside of us. Think of the Meno again, and of Socrates' doctrine there that all knowledge is recollection. When you learn something, Socrates says, you are only becoming aware that you already knew it. No one can really teach you anything in the strict sense. All they can do is turn your intellectual eyesight in the right direction, and then you see. Again, from Plato's Republic, education isn't what people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. The power to learn is present in everyone's soul. Education is the craft concerned with this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned in the right way, looking where it ought to look, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. I think the analogy to eyesight is very illuminating. The human mind is constituted in such a way that it cannot but agree to truth. When the mind encounters truth, it can't resist assenting to it. It literally cannot. It's like the eye. If it's open, it cannot help but see. It cannot decide not to see. The mind is like an eye looking, and when it encounters truth, it cannot help but see it. Let me illustrate. Take the simple mathematical proposition 2 plus 3 equals 5. We all know that. And that knowledge illustrates perfectly the 2 points implied in Plato's analogy of the eye. The first point is that no one actually taught you that 2 plus 3 equals 5. All somebody did was point it out to you. Once you understand what numbers are and what the operation of addition is, then you see that 2 plus 3 is 5. Your elementary school teacher or your parent didn't teach that to you. They pointed it out to you, and you saw it. This is the first point. The second point is that you can't help but see it. Nobody can truly deny that 2 plus 3 is 5. You can't. You can close your eyes and shake your head and repeat like an incantation, 2 plus 3 is not 5. You can be stubborn and insist on it verbally, even swear by it, but you can't believe it. The mind cannot help but assent to what is true. Liberal education takes these insights as axiomatic. Liberal education turns your intellectual eyes onto yourself. It is a practice of self-examination, of looking into yourself under the provocation of various prompts that make the liberal arts curriculum. In the Politics, Aristotle makes another relevant point. He says a complete community, comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. Aristotle's insight here is quite crucial. While survival and sustenance are at bottom the reasons why we live together, any well-organized society will overcome the threat of extinction quite quickly. Once the necessaries of survival are assured, the questions of living shift fundamentally, and we begin to concern ourselves not just with survival, but with existence. How do we live well? What kind of knowledge best guides life? What do we do when most of our physical and mental energy doesn't go to just surviving? Here's Cicero again. The search for truth and its investigation are, above all, peculiar to man. Therefore, whenever we are free from necessary business and other concerns, we are eager to see or to hear or to learn, considering that the discovery of obscure or wonderful things is necessary for a blessed life. I love that the discovery of obscure and wonderful things is necessary for the blessed life. To put it in the language we have been examining, the discovery of obscure or wonderful things is necessary for human arete, for human excellence. Did you know that the word skola, from which we get the Greek word skole, from which we get the word school, means leisure, having nothing to do? School is not supposed to be about work, Ted. It's supposed to be about what you do when you don't have to work. And you know what you do when you don't have to work? You delight in the discovery of obscure and wonderful things. So, to return to the important question that Socrates turned us towards, the one about meaning, the meaning of human excellence, I think that we can propose that human excellence is going to require activity that is not bound to some practical purpose, but leisure activity, scholarly activity, activity motivated simply by delight inherent in the discovery of obscure and wonderful things. So thank you, Cicero. But it's striking to me that most of our education, with its emphasis on economic rewards, educates as if our main goal in life were to earn sustenance. It is caught in the human desire for domination, accumulation, and security. Our situation in this regard is analogous to our situation with regard to food. We are evolutionarily programmed to want to eat a lot more than we need, on the presumption that food will not always be available. Our desire for food far exceeds our need for food, and then we convert the extra calories into fat and store it all over our bodies. The way we eat evolved to keep us going through periods of plenty and through periods of famine. So now, when food is always available, we're facing an epidemic of obesity. Our bodies and our appetites are not evolved to handle the permanent abundance of food. So in order to stay healthy, we have to make a conscious effort, a sometimes very difficult and painful effort, not to give our bodies the high sugar, high fat, delicious food they're always wanting. This is something we all have to live with and can understand at an individual level. But something similar is happening at the collective level. The bulk of our education is focused on preparing us for jobs rather than preparing us to find ways of living sustainably. We should be thinking not about what job we will have, but about what kind of life we will live. Our task should be to organize our lives in such a way that our life activity itself produces the means of our sustenance. We should be in the business of fashioning a life and a society in which we don't have to sell some portion of our humanity every day for the privilege of living on the weekends. To use the biblical phrase, we should be in the business of creating a life and a society where you don't have to sell your birthright for a mess of pottage. When our approach to education is non-liberal, we keep our students' attention riveted to the job market, to the acquisition of skills, to earning potentials. It's not that these things aren't important. Like food, they are very important. But as with food, our appetite exceeds our wisdom. The fact that food matters doesn't mean that we should eat as much as possible or that we should not restrain our appetite. We must restrain our appetite, or we will kill ourselves. Something like this is happening at the societal level. Since we invented the atom bomb, it's been widely understood that our advanced brains, mounted as they are on the psychology of a skittish and insecure ancestral ape, might quite possibly lead to our self-extermination. Although we can't change society in one fell swoop, the college's mission must include looking beyond the materialist ethos of our times and educating ourselves to be free rather than enslaved to our desire for power, wealth, and security. This is the category of issue which liberal education addresses. It is an invitation to grapple with the big questions of human existence. And this is important because the big questions come with the territory of being free. Freedom, is great, but it brings its own problems. We are unique in the world in that we don't just follow physical laws or even our instinct. We can inhabit the world and interact with it in a way that is free, in a way that is indeterminate and indeterminable, governed by laws of our own making. Rocks, tables, clouds are not in the world in the same way that we are. We are in the world in the same way that they are, but we are also in the world in a way that is peculiar to us. We are aware of ourselves, and we are aware of ourselves as being aware. It is this doubling of awareness upon itself that makes us a different sort of thing than rocks, tables, clouds, and as far as we know, even other animals. We are ourselves by virtue of our own awareness of being ourselves. We are what we are aware of being. This self-referential and self-constituting ontological condition means that we're not a determinate thing like a rock or a horse. We have an indeterminate, self-actualizing soul. We have the quality of freedom. It is this quality that the liberal education aims at and with which it is engaged. I hope I'm not losing too many of you, so let me call on multimedia to help illustrate the condition of freedom and indeterminacy that I am describing. Here's a video of a double pendulum, where one pendulum swings from another pendulum, so one pendulum swings from a swinging pendulum. This simple mechanism illustrates something very profound. So there's a pendulum just swinging, following simple laws of motion. Now this gentleman is going to cut that tie, releasing the second joint, making it a double pendulum. So now you're going to have a double pendulum swinging. Try to detect a pattern in the pendulum, a pattern that will allow you to predict its movement. You can't detect the pattern, and that's because there isn't one. The two pendulum scenario is a chaotic system. The system's movements, though strictly determined by simple laws of physics, are in fact unpredictable and unascertainable. It is impossible for us to determine from the initial conditions how the double pendulum is going to move. The double pendulum, in other words, undergoes chaotic motion. But complex systems can get even more indeterminate. The double pendulum is what's called a first-order chaotic system. There is also a second-order chaotic system. That's when the system reacts to predictions made about it, so that understanding any part of the system that functions predictably immediately changes it and the system itself. The stock market is like this. If we could predict what the stock market was going to do, the stock market would adapt to that knowledge and invalidate our prediction. Self-knowledge is also indeterminate in this second-order way. Our self-understanding changes us. In the act of knowing ourselves, we become something different. The object we know is changed by our knowing it. So we live as fundamentally, radically indeterminate beings. That is, as free beings. The Greeks boasted that they were free, eleutheroi. And because of this freedom, they were morally superior to the barbaroi, those who were under subjection. This is because freedom is a condition for moral excellence. Morality only counts as such when it is an expression of freedom. That is, I think, an intuitive understanding for us, that morality only counts as such when it is an expression of our freedom. So Kant says, for example, that the science of the laws of nature is called physics, whereas the science of the laws of freedom is called ethics. Let me illustrate. Imagine you see somebody walking perhaps at a hurried pace, and that person stops to help a blind person who's having trouble crossing the street cross the street. You look at that action and you recognize that it has moral worth. You recognize there's an act that has moral value, having just been performed. But imagine that then you learn that the person who stopped actually was compelled to stop, that the person had to stop, that the person, imagine, had committed some offense before, and as a punishment, the person had to stop every time they saw somebody having trouble crossing the street and help them. The person, in fact, did not want to stop, but had to. The moment you learn that, the action loses its moral quality, because the action is only moral when it is an expression of freedom. Hence, Kant says that the laws that govern freedom are called ethics. Because of this connection to freedom, the qualities that a liberal arts education cultivates are moral as well as intellectual. Qualities such as integrity, honesty, humility, tolerance for ambiguity. These are character virtues, not merely intellectual virtues. They express not only intelligence, but human arete. Let me end with this. Sometimes people say that what characterizes liberal learning is exactly its uselessness. That the point of liberal learning is that it is not pursued as a means to obtain something else, but that it is simply sought for its own sake. I see the point, but I disagree with that way of looking at it. A liberal education is extremely useful, and we pursue it for the highest of human ends. To put it simply, a liberal education is there to help you find your way. And this is your basic task in life, to find your way. There is, in the final analysis, nothing else for you to do in life but to find your way. Not somebody else's way, not the way of your role models or of your parents, not the way of success, but your way. A liberal education does not tell you what your way is, but it equips you for a kind of self-exploration and investigation of the world around you that can lead to genuine living, to a life of honesty and clarity. That life might include making a lot of money, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you rich. That life might include having an impact on many lives around you, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to make you into a benefactor of humanity. That life might include many friends, but it might not. The point of liberal education is not to turn you into a social butterfly. But a liberally educated life will be richer than otherwise. It will be more true, and it will be more awake. It will be more alive and creative, and it will be more free. To modify a quote from Henry David Thoreau, if a liberal education does one thing, it is to ensure that when you come to die, you don't then discover that you have not lived. Okay, thank you. I think we have some room for questions, right? Yeah? Questions or comments. I'm not one of those people that says, unless you actually have a question, you can't, making people make long comments and then saying, what do you think about that? If you have a comment or a question, please, I'd love to hear it. Yes.
If you can ask Plato one question, what would it be?
Where would we be? What would be the setting of this? Would he be like here? Because I would ask him, what do you think about all of this? What do you think about this projection? But I don't have a question that I'm burning to ask of Plato. I might want to have some details about Socrates' personal life that he doesn't get into in the dialogues. Yeah. Other questions or comments? I'll try to have better answers than the one I just had. That was a hard one.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And what I understood, what do you think of saying, you said education is enslaved in the kind of the action. So is private education considered, in a way, because they have certain ideas that they're implicating in that institution as compared to the state education, like public?
Mm-hmm. Tell me more. I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
Well, I'm just saying, is private education in the way that kind of, as I understood it, of the slaved and non-slaved, is private education would be considered as a slave institution?
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. So the way that I'm thinking about non-liberal education, which you can call slave education, but it can also be just like technical vocational education, skills training. So say a physician has to learn a lot of actual skills, like how do you listen to the heartbeat and tell if it's normal? How do you put an IV line? How do you put a line into the vein to draw blood? That just takes practice, and you learn how to do that. That's not liberal education, because it is education that is tailored to a particular narrow task. It's important education. It is valuable education. It is necessary education. Boy, am I glad when a doctor or a medical practitioner of any kind has to draw blood from me, that they know how to do that. Yet that education is not liberal. There is something that happens in non-elite institutions where sometimes students are taught a non-liberal education that is not just like innocently technical proficiency, but that actually is an education in docility, in passivity, in obedience, a sort of education that produces laborers, that produces obedient, docile laborers. And that is a slavish education. And that is, in my definition, just like the opposite of education. Education ought to be liberating. Yeah. And that does not track along private and public institutions. There are both sets of things are done in both. Part of the argument I make, I made it at the beginning of the talk, is that the institutions that are most accessible to populations that have been traditionally excluded from higher education, low income, first generation college attendees, institutions that are most within their reach, I think have a special responsibility and duty to teach liberal education. Yet, the argument goes the other way, that those institutions, because they serve low income, first generation college access people, should just focus on job training and skills. And it is a pernicious ideology that actually reinforces subjugation, oppression, and that, as I said, it has the effect of keeping those who are down. Back.
So in a liberal education, would you agree with the fact that college tuition should be free then for students?
I'm not sure that a commitment, so liberal education doesn't need to happen in a college. Liberal education can happen just in the outdoors, and it in fact happens in non-academic institutions. Should college education be free for the student? Yes, I think that college education should be free for the student. College education cannot be free. That is, the lights have to run, the professors have to get paid, the staff has to get paid, the building has to be maintained, technology has to be up to date. So education is not going to be free. But education should not, it should not be at the cost of the student. Now you can get into detailed discussions, for example, like, one of the criticisms that is made to free education, to free college, which is a couple of presidential candidates are talking about that idea of just free college for all. One of the criticisms that is made of that idea, which is a criticism that has merit, I think, is that already most people who go to college are middle and upper middle class. So that making college free would actually be giving a huge break to a large section of the population that doesn't need it. There are plenty of people that go to college that can afford to pay for college and that maybe should pay for college. Columbia, the school where I teach, has a year's expenses, tuition, board expenses. A year at Columbia is $77,000. 50% of the people at Columbia are on financial aid. A smaller percent than that, but still a significant percent, have full need financial aid. That is, they are essentially not paying anything. But that means that there is half of the student body at Columbia whose families are shelling out $77,000 a year for their child's education. Some of those families do that without batting an eye. For some of those families, that's totally fine. It does not really impact their financial security or well-being. Should those families get to go to college for free? Maybe not. I think there is a legitimate case to be made that maybe the idea of free college blanket maybe is not the best use of resources. Yet, I think the basic ideal that we're debating is that nobody ought to be excluded from a college education because they can't afford it or because it would put them into debt. And I think that that is a commitment that we as a society ought to revive, that we have had. If you look at the history of American higher education until recently, it has been a history of opening up doors more and more generous financial aid, more generous recruitment, more open admissions. That began to turn around beginning with the Reagan administration and a reformulation of college of funding, of federal aid to students, turning many grants to loans. But then it has just accelerated from there with massive divestment by state governments in public education and a concomitant thinning out of resources and the educational experience of students in many public institutions. So anyway, I'm going on and on, but those are my general thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. What I heard you saying a lot of, if I could paraphrase, is there's this metacognition or reflection element of a liberal education that's very important. I was wondering what areas of colleges do you think really could expand in those capacities in order to help students better reflect on their own existence?
Yeah. Well, in my remarks, I focus on what happens in the classroom and what happens curricularly, and I think that is center stage. That is, a college is an institution of education whose primary function is to have students and faculty in a room interacting. So the most important thing that a college can do is there, by having courses like the Great Question Seminar and courses that expose students regardless of their major, not the English majors, not the philosophy majors. They're going to have that, or at least they have a much greater chance of having that, but every student, not the liberal arts students only, but every student exposed to this sort of education. So that's center stage. But there are many other sites that the university can facilitate that happening, from kind of psychological services that need to be offered to fostering certain kinds of affinity communities, clubs, and common interests, and guest speakers and activities together. So in fact, the whole kind of ethos of the college activity should be infused by this spirit of self-reflection and self-inquiry. As it does in the classroom, that happens through conversation. That is, it happens by putting people in situations where they can speak to each other about the most important questions in life. So beside the classroom, there are lots of ways in which we can do that and which colleges should support that being done. Yeah.
Thank you. I was really moved by the quote you shared from Frederick Douglass, is that correct? And
Narrative of the Life of an American Slave.
yeah, it's
It's
great.
full of stuff like that.
It's great. And how you said that education forever unfit him to be a slave. I was wondering if in today's society, because outside of situations of great tragedy, we're not owned by other people, if there's any attitude or behavior that you see in modern society that could be freed or changed by education.
Absolutely. One is the unrestrained pursuit of profit. Our education, because it has educated us as if the point in life was to do that, to accumulate more and more. I think has generated a society where that value is dominant, where that value is actually destroying us. And it's generated a world in which we are doing irreversible damage to the biosphere, both in the environment, in the sense of human-caused climate change, but also the destruction of species, other species, and biodiversity, exploiting the planet in unsustainable ways. That has been, I think, supported by our education and can be ameliorated by our education. We have that restraining of that appetite for accumulation, also restraining of the appetite for domination. With our competitive winner-takes-all economic and social arrangements, we encourage the unrestrained pursuit of self-satisfaction, even at the expense of others. We cultivate the already existing human propensity for domination and exploitation and subjugation of a fellow human being, and of animals too. That is a feature that our education has too much encouraged, and our education can restrain, can do something about. Then I would say that one of the ultimate tasks of a liberal education is to allow us to experience how someone else experiences the world, or at least to allow us to imagine how someone else experiences the world. That is one of the most difficult things to do. But it is a thing that liberal education is the most powerful way we know of to cultivate the capacity that we undeniably have of imagining what it's like for somebody else to experience the world from their shoes. Those are areas, and I'm sure that there are others, where I think our educational system is both falling short and has a tremendous opportunity to do better.
Thank you, Doctor, for this presentation. This has to do with, you mentioned musicians being virtuous, right? And this has more to do with your campus specifically, Columbia. Vampire Weekend, a band that has reached mainstream success. My question is, how can you facilitate virtuous musicians on your campus? Because Vampire Weekend, in my opinion, is far from virtuous.
Well, I only have the vaguest notion of Vampire Weekend and their music, so I can't comment on them. One of the things that I am most proud of the Columbia core curriculum is that it has a course called Music Humanities. That is something like, it's like a great question seminar, but it is about musical text or musical composition. So every student at Columbia takes this one semester course in which they learn to listen closely, attentively, analytically to music by studying some of the great composers and great compositions in the Western tradition, from Gregorian chant to like contemporary experimental music. So that, I think, is a step in the direction of cultivating a virtuous relationship to music. I suspect that Vampire Weekend's moral failings that you point to are due not to their Columbia education, but to other broader cultural factors that they live in.
Thank you. One more question, Doctor, and this is because you quoted Henry David Thoreau.
Love that guy.
Who would you have a beer with? Would it be Henry David Thoreau or Ralph Waldo Emerson?
I have to say my favorite writer of those two is Henry David Thoreau, but he would probably be no fun to have a beer with. I'll go with Emerson.
I understand.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
Right.
Again, thank you for speaking. I made a couple of notes while you were talking, and when you were talking back toward the beginning of the talk toward Athens and democracy and the purpose of liberal education, one of my positions with ACC helps sell our Great Questions program to faculty, staff, to inform people on what it is, on the use of liberal education. A citizen in Athens was an 18-year-old land-owning male.
Yes.
It was very, very limited to who had access to this education. In our current political sphere, not to get too political on it, do you see this, our current administration's thrust toward technical education and vocational schools and community colleges should be just this?
Yeah.
As a continuation of that sort of thought process that the working class doesn't need this sort of education, that they are not privy to it, that it would only upset them and make them rowdy, going back to your slave commentary.
Yes.
Is that, do you sort of see in the broader picture, not so granular, this feeling that we have that community college, because of the populations that it accesses, we feel should be the bastion of liberal education, and is being touted time and time again is not the place for that?
Exactly, and that's the opposite of that.
Yeah.
As the place for vocational or pre-professional or applied education. I think it's a huge mistake, and I think certainly the current administration's policies are aggressively pushing that agenda. And it is an agenda that benefits particular economic sectors of the society and not others. It is an agenda that I think it's in some cases motivated by a unobjectionable goal. That is, I think it's an agenda that is in some cases motivated by, I think, a prejudiced and misinformed idea of the capacities and what's good for the students. But I grant that I think some people hold those ideas sincerely and think that this is what is best for the students. I think that is an underestimation, and George Bush, your former governor and then president, came up with this phrase, or one of his speechwriters came up with this phrase, but it's a very good phrase, I think, the soft bigotry of low expectations. That's what that is. The idea that the populations that are most served by our most accessible institutions are best fit and best suited for this kind of vocational, job training oriented education is a form of bigotry, sometimes well-intentioned. I think sometimes also done with full cognition of the fact that you are trying to keep a certain population in a certain place for the purpose of easy economic exploitation.
That's disturbing. I would say in light of that, with the student loan crisis going on, that they're using that as sort of a banner for, you need job skills to go get a job.
Yeah.
But when you told me, like earlier when you said, like, not what kind of job do you want, what kind of life do you want, I've never once been asked that in my entire life.
Yeah, yeah.
No one asks you what kind of life you want when you grow up. They ask you what you want to be when you grow up.
Yeah.
And happy and fulfilled and virtuous is not an answer that you can give in our society.
Right.
So thank you for giving me that option.
I believe you stated that a liberal education can and should take place outside the college campus.
As well, yes.
Could you give us some more examples of how that would be
Yeah,
done?
sure. I think, a clear and obvious site is kind of the culture industry, movies and plays and popular literature and popular music. That is, there are ways of connecting with a dimension of human experience that is aesthetic and that is kind of philosophical. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is talking about those things. And that happens, in cafes, at parties, online. on social media. There are some good things that happen on social media. So, sometimes people are very worried about the state of the humanities and the liberal arts. And indeed, the liberal arts and the humanities are in a kind of institutional crisis, but it is an institutional crisis. It is a crisis of the institution. Out there in the world, the liberal arts and the humanities are thriving. They are just going full steam. And they're, because liberal education addresses a fundamental need and a fundamental thirst in the human soul. And we have an opportunity to do it well, to do it thoughtfully, to do it rigorously, methodically, and we are failing at doing that, but it still continues to happen outside of the institutions, not as thoroughly, not as effectively, not as intensively. Yeah. And let me just add another thing. Religious institutions often do a lot of this. Churches and other forms of faith communities often do this kind of stuff as well.
Do you think that science education and liberal education can be intertwined? From what I understand about archaeology, I feel that although it does require a certain set of skills and a certain sense of obedience, it also rejects ethnocentrism, and I think can help open the door for people who might not be interested in science but have those great questions.
Absolutely. I think science not only can, but it must be intertwined. Or in fact, let me put it this way. I think science must be taught also as a liberal art, and not only as a technical art, right? And teaching science in a liberal arts way means recognizing the achievements of science as human endeavors and human achievements, and the fundamental expression of the human being in the quest for accurate knowledge. I said in the talk that only truth satisfies, and the scientific method, it is the most powerful way of determining empirical truth, determining truth in the natural world. And there is, even the most esoteric forms of scientific research, some of the stuff that happens in astrophysics, or some of the stuff that happens in quantum mechanics, that has no practical application whatsoever, yet are pursued with complete vigor and satisfaction. And for us, we, even non-scientists, get such tremendous satisfaction and fulfillment from simply understanding vast and large things that, whether the universe is expanding or contracting, it really doesn't change anything about my life. But boy, whenever some fundamental insight about the mechanism of the universe enters my consciousness, it is I feel most human and most fulfilled and most arete in that. So yeah, I think science is definitely a liberal art. And you can do it as a non-liberal art, and most science in colleges is done as a non-liberal art, but I think it is also liberal art.
Before I thank you for your excellent talk and your excellent questions, I want to tell you about the next step, because unlike a regular lecture, this is a great question-sponsored lecture, so we are going to have a discussion. We've got some snacks and coffee and water to refresh ourselves in the back, and then we're going to turn this room into a circle, and we are going to talk. And the objective is to just become more thoughtful. Dr. Montás, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Ted.
Appreciated your talk.
Yeah, thank you.